And today I'm going to be discussing the attack on pensions, how your pension is in danger, how the pensions are being stolen, and I'm going to pay particular attention to how the New York Times is repositioning this issue to make it acceptable to the public in order to have their pensions looted. Let me start off by telling you that today, and I'll explain how this came to be, the underfunding of public and private pensions is on the order of $2 trillion. $2 trillion that ought to be in the pension funds to pay you your pension is not there. It's roughly $500 billion in the private sector and roughly $1.5 trillion in the public sector. Now, there are many people in New York who think because of an amendment to the New York State Constitution that their pension is guaranteed by the Constitution of the state and that they're going to get it no matter what. That is wrong. The New York State Constitution does not and cannot guarantee the purchasing power of the money, and in fact, firemen, police, teachers, anybody who has part of that $145 billion in the New York State Pension Fund, they're going to be sadly disappointed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show how this shortfall in the pensions really is a result of malfeasance in the monetary structure. I'm going to connect the dots from you. It's a little bit involved getting into, but bear with me for a few minutes. There's a pretty good punchline, and then I'm going to go into how the New York Times is repositioning the issue, and then we're going to take it from there. Let me start with the first slide, please. Folks, this is something that you've seen from me before several times. And what it shows is the money creation here in the United States from roughly 1946 to about last year. And in 1946, the money supply in the United States was roughly $146 trillion. Today, it's roughly $11.5 trillion. So you can come back to me, Gloria. So where did all this extra money come from? And again, as I've explained in several shows, all of the money in our country is created out of nothing by the banking system. A small amount is created out of nothing by the Federal Reserve, and then a group of private companies called banks have been improperly empowered by the Congress to create money out of nothing. Now, up until roughly 1933, the money that we had in this country, with one brief period during the Civil War, was redeemable into gold and silver. However, that changed. And again, leaving out the story, what I want to emphasize to you is how this change in the nature of our money led to the underfunding of the pensions. Now, let me put up the next slide. This shows 10-year interest rates in the United States from 1926 to present. And I don't know if you can see it clearly on the screen, but before the shading starts, up until about 1959, interest rates in this country were always less than 4%. I'll show you a long-term chart in just a moment. But after really after 1971, and that's when the last tie to gold was broken, interest rates started to take off. Let me have the next chart, please. Much more important for pensions are the changes in interest rates, or rather the volatility in interest rates. And as you can see in this chart, from the period of 1926 up until the middle to late 1970s, on a yearly basis, interest rates changed generally not more than 1%, and in most of the years, not more than, say, 1/3%. And then I have the next slide, please. And then I show this same volatility going back to 1790. And the interesting thing about this chart is that except for the period 1812, where there's a blip, 1833, when the Second Bank of the United States was denied by Andrew Jackson, the 1850s during the Civil War. After the Civil War, from the period roughly 1868, which is when they resumed gold, up to World War I in 1918, interest rates were fairly stable. And in fact, they hardly changed more than really a fraction of a percent in any year for a 50-year period. Then World War II came, you had a little blip. You had a very tiny little blip in 1929, and then another little blip up to the Korean War. And then roughly around the 1960s, things started to change. Okay, you can come back to me, Gloria. Now, what's important to realize about this volatility in interest rates is that according to generally accepted accounting principles, pension plan assets are very dependent on interest rates, and changes in interest rate change the value of pension plan assets, and these changes flow back to the bottom line. And so as interest rates became unstable, and again, they became unstable after this last link to gold was broken, corporate earnings became unstable, again, because of the accounting rules. Now, anyone who knows anything about the stock markets and the equity markets knows that management hates volatility in earnings. They get penalized for volatility in earnings. Plus, they don't know if their options are good. So management started to complain during this period, and they made a fairly cogent argument for smoothing interest rates. They said, look, the pension liabilities don't come due for many years. Why should we be penalized now for something that's not going to happen for years in the future? Let's smooth out the interest rates based on past performance. And so now the question came up, well, who's going to do the smoothing? And the answer is the actuaries or the accountants, or perhaps working together. Now, management is not a disinterested party in this smoothing. And in fact, the higher the interest rates, the more they can assume that the assets already in the pension plan are going to return, the less the companies have to contribute to the pension plans. This is where the shortfall comes from, and the better reported earnings. In other words, if they have to contribute less to the pension plan, more money is available for earnings for the company, and the company looks more profitable. Now, I can tell you, I'm a former IBM employee, and for the period that I was with IBM, they always had an assumed rate of return, something on the order of just a few percent. But come the mid-1980s, IBM and even General Motors and really all the companies popped up this assumed rate of return to as much as 11, 12, 13%. These are absurd amounts. But the result is that after they started increasing this assumed rate of return based on the smoothing, and again, the smoothing came about because of volatility in the interest rates, which came about because they broke the last tie to gold, now they don't have to contribute any more to their pension funds. And in fact, I remember a period from roughly the mid-1980s forward, IBM in prior years had been contributing $1 billion a year to their pension fund. They never contributed another penny. And that $1 billion a year that they had been contributing to their pension fund, that $1 billion fell to the bottom line. So now IBM looks like a much more profitable company than it was before the last tie to gold was broken. And I'm not singling out IBM because IBM did anything particularly wrong here. Every company did it, which is why today pensions in America are underfunded to the tune of about $2 trillion. And the reason they're more underfunded in the public sector than in the private sector is that in the public sector there is less accountability. So how is the major media, and I want to use the New York Times as an example, and I have roughly 8 quotes coming up, how is the major media treating this underfunding of the pension funds? Well, they did a little story last September 18th. It was called, Whoops, There Goes Another Pension. And I have a bunch of quotes from this story to show you how the major media is really trying to position, really, in effect, the stealing of workers' pensions. So let me have the next slide, please. This slide talks about a fellow by the name of Robert Miller, who was brought in to help turn around Bethlehem Steel. And what it says is Robert Miller is a turnaround artist with a Dickinsonian twist. He unlocks hidden value in floundering Rust Belt companies by jettisoning their pension funds. Come back to me, please. So here we have the New York Times explaining that this guy's this genius. He goes to these companies who have made promises to the workers, and somehow he's able to jettison the pension plan. That's really a euphemism for reneging on the promises that they made to these steel workers and, in effect, unlocking hidden value in the company. In effect, that hidden value is the money that should have gone to the workers.